I think there is another perception in Nepal that India tries to, or not just tries, it micromanages. So anything, be it a small event, be it a transfer of a secretary or whatever, for a lot of people, they try to immediately question if India was behind that, or why would India be doing that? In that sense, I think there is that suspicion. There is that suspicion. And part of that suspicion is because we ourselves are weak, and we recognize that internally, but we do not want to accept that we are weak. Therefore, we try to pin the blame on India.
Welcome to the Gist on StratNewsGlobal. I'm Ramananda Sengupta. Today, we will be discussing Nepal-India relations, which, despite a very long and ancient heritage, appears to be fraying slightly at the edges of late. Our special guest today is Santosh Sharma Poudel, co-founder of the Nepal Institute for Policy Research and faculty of the Department of International Relations and Diplomacy, Tribhuvan University, Kathmandu. Santosh also writes regularly for various Nepali and foreign publications, not just on Nepal, but also on South Asia and even the Indo-Pacific. Thank you so very much for joining us today, Santosh. It's a real honor to have you with us.
Thank you, Sen. Looking forward to the discussion.
Yes. Thank you so much. You know, as I was saying, what do you think has sort of led to this sort of a disconnect between the two nations, which have had sort of a relationship for so very long?
I think you're right in the sense that Nepal and India go millennia old. It's not even centuries old relationship. I think for the longest time, the civilization was common. People moved from one country to another. Nepal and India share a relationship even before Nepal and India were formed as independent states of their own. So even during that time, there was trade, people-to-people connectivity was there for the longest period of time. India, especially Varanasi, used to be the center for Nepali education and cultural heritage and so forth. I think in that sense, I think Nepal and India goes millennia old. I think the Mahabharata, that is common over the whole, not just Nepal and India, but over the whole South Asian region. That provides another common cultural and religious framework for Nepal and India to be connected to. I think modern Nepal-India relations started, especially since India got independence and Nepal became a democratic state in 1950, and India became independent in 1947. I think since that time, we have had a modern state-to-state relations. I think the best part about Nepal, especially Indian role in Nepal, is India has always been engaged since then, since 1947, in Nepal's internal politics to a large degree. I think the 1950 movement for democracy owes a large degree to the India's contribution towards Nepal's democratization. In that sense, we go back a long way in recognizing Indian contribution to Nepali politics. However, probably it is also the same fact that has led to some tensions between Nepal and India, in the sense that as soon as Indian involvement started, I think so did some sentiments against India. Or I think even in early 1950s, Nepal was already seeing some anti-Indian protests, in a smaller scale, but then we are already seeing some sort of that. But I think Nepal-India relations is so dynamic, so multidimensional, in the sense that it has encompassed all those and has survived, and it has thickened. We have had up and downs, quite multiple up and downs actually. I think on top of my head, I can recall the year 1989 when there was the first blockade, Indian blockade. But as a result of that, again, in Nepal, we had the democratic movement again, which introduced democracy in Nepal in 1990. And then again, during the Madras Andolan, there was issues during the Maoist insurgency when it was nearing an end. There was a big role that India played in Nepal. So did India during 2015, again, when Nepal was to promulgate its first constitution through the Constituent Assembly. And in all those times, I think the Indian engagement in Nepal has been welcomed, but also despised at the same time, which is a particular conundrum in Nepal-India relations, that for a lot of Nepalese, they want India's role, but then they despise when they see it as an intervention. So there's always been that delicate balance that is always going on. So when that balance goes a bit in terms of intervention, that's when Nepal-India relations takes a deep dive. But at the same time, when it has supported, for example, the democratic movement at different times, again, we appreciate and also we expect that contribution from India. In that sense, it has its up and down. I think coming to the last decade or so, we had a couple of more issues than we normally have with India. So starting with 2015, I think that was when Nepal was about to promulgate the new constitution. India had some concerns over a few provisions in the constitution. Chief of them was regarding the citizenship of the people in southern plains of Nepal. Now, the group largely known as Madhesis, I think those were historically marginalized groups, even though their population is significant in overall Nepali population, but they were marginalized to a large extent in terms of politics, in terms of power, in terms of the access to the government as well. And even at times, their nationality was questioned. So in that sense, I think India had some national concern for them, which brought out a bit of tense relationship between Nepal and India. Again, in 2019, when Nepal amended the constitution regarding to change the territory that included the Lipulek, Kalapani, and Limpiadura into Nepali territory, then again, we had a significant dip in relations between the two countries. However, the interesting part about Nepal-India relations is that no matter how deep it goes, it finds a way to come to the surface. I think nothing extraordinary happened after 2015, but the relation came to normalcy. Similarly, in 2019, it had reached another, but without any outstanding agreement between the two. Again, by itself, naturally, it came to a very normal level. That shows both the problems associated with Nepal and India relations, but also the strength of Nepal-India relations and the kind of interest that Nepal and India share with each other.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. You know that India has a neighborhood first policy with this new government. And
Right.
Would you agree that, post, let's say, 2015, after that Madheshi thing, that India has sort of deliberately tried to tone down any overt attempts at interfering or things like that in Nepal, barring the maps issue, of course, that came later. But I think there's been a subtle difference, or
I think we saw subtle difference with the Gujarat Doctrine in the 1990s. I think that was when I think India came up with the idea of non-reciprocity, which was, I think, very important, not just to Nepal, but also to other smaller states in South Asia. And in 2015, I think, with when Modi came to power, what we saw was much more active engagement at political level between India and Nepal, especially from the Indian end. I think for a long time, no Indian prime minister had visited Nepal. I think that changed very quickly after Modi came to power, and I think he has already been to Nepal more than, I think, 4 or 5 times.
that's right.
So that does it increase. I think in terms of narrative, I think neighborhood first policy picked up in Nepal. I think the first time Modi came to Nepal and he delivered a speech in the Nepal's parliament, I think it was a huge hit. He also gave the formula for hit, but I think even it was a big hit in Nepal. Like Modi and his perception was so popular. I think it was dampened when 2015 happened. And then I think in terms of the concrete activities, there has been less in that end to increase the good neighborhood, to advance the good neighborhood first policy. But in terms of rhetoric, there has been a marked improvement for sure.
Uh-huh. That's interesting. You were talking about Modi's visit to Nepal. We had, the Nepal's Prime Minister, Pushpa Kamal Dahal, or Prachanda, as he is better known as, was. He was here, I think, in late May this year.
Yeah.
And a lot of agreements and all were signed, even though some of the touch points were not addressed really directly. They may have done it
Right.
privately. But do you think those agreements, which mostly revolved around economic issues and a bit of, of course, people to people connect, do you think that will help ease some of the sort of, bad blood that seems to be brewing between the two nations?
Right. I think the last visit by Nepali Prime Minister, I think Prasanda, to India, what I liked about that particular visit of his was the issues discussed were much more business-like, in the sense that I think they avoided discussing some really contentious issues. For example, the territorial issue or the EPZ, the Eminent Persons Group's report. I think they avoided that. But in doing so, I think they took forward what could be agreed upon. So chief among them were economic issues, people-to-people movement, or even the electricity, the power trade between the two countries and connectivity and so forth. So in that sense, I think it's one way to advance Nepal-India relations, that, there are contentious issues, there will be contentious issues as far as our interest overlap to a large extent. One way is to keep aside those contentious issues and carry on where cooperation can be done on an immediate basis. I think the visit achieved that goal to a large extent. And in that sense, I think it has definitely helped advance that relations. But I think some credit also has to go to the former Prime Minister Deoba's visit. I think that's when Nepal and India got to a smooth start after the 2019 turmoil. So in that sense, I think Prasanda's visit just continued that trend forward.
Mm-hmm. But, since then, do you see movement on the ground, or do you think it's still rhetoric?
But there has been some movement as well, in the sense that I think Indian Nepal cooperation, for example, some of them has materialized. The railway to Omlikans that had started, I think the pipelines, the ICPs, and these are some areas of cooperation where we have seen some concrete progress. Now, most of these had started before that and were completed in recent times. So in that sense, I think, again, it's a continuation, but together with that, the kind of agreement that we saw on hydroelectricity with India agreeing to buy more power from Nepal and on building more railway links to Nepal, I think those are some concrete steps that we have seen in the last few years between the two countries.
Mm-hmm. So, you're saying that these things are sort of moving. I mean, the pace might not be as fast as everybody wants, but it's moving. What are the other areas where you think we can sort of, some low-hanging fruits where we can sort of progress?
There are a lot, I think, and that is one area which baffles me, in the sense that there are so many low-hanging fruit. I think hydroelectricity, power trade, which is, again, complementary in multiple ways. I think Nepal needs less power during the monsoon. India needs more power during that time. Nepal needs to import power during winter. That's when India needs less. Besides that, I think hydroelectricity, India needs to have more cleaner energy supply to achieve its goals. The Paris Agreement and so forth, its commitment to be carbon neutral by 2070. So that was one which has progressed. I think another area is cooperation in e-commerce, or in general, the digitalization of payments and so forth between India and Nepal. I think that was another area, because consumption pattern is very similar in the two countries. And a lot of times, I think we in Nepal get a hint about our fashion from India. So in that sense, I think it just extends the market large and makes it a lot easier for transactions and so forth. It also makes it easier for Indian tourists when they visit Nepal, that they don't have to change money all the time, like I think with the same payment, because Indian tourists account for the largest number of tourists in Nepal, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's another area where cooperation is a low-hanging fruit. In some other areas, for example, the border management or the control of illicit activities along the border is another area which is a very low-hanging fruit that needs to be done. There are mechanisms across the border on both ends whereby some district level committees are there to address it. But I think that can and should be taken further, so that there are a lot of issues. For example, criminals crossing over the border to escape being caught in another country, or counterfeiting and so forth. I think it's another area where cooperation can happen and should happen, and it's not very difficult to achieve that.
Mm-hmm. You're talking about financial ties. It also would help, I suppose, remittances from Nepali workers in India who want to send money back home.
Indeed. I think that's huge market for that, in the sense that I think even though we don't have a very formal concrete number, but I'm assuming it's more than 1 million Nepali people working in India, and
Right.
rather similar number of Indian workers in Nepal. So that will help digitalize the remittance and so forth as well. I think that should help quite a lot about formalizing the economy as well, to a large extent.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the sort of some people describe it as the elephant in the room, and that is China. What is the relationship between the common Nepalese and China? I mean, I'm not talking about the Communist Party of Nepal with the Communist Party of China, but the common people, are they comfortable dealing with China?
I think there are two parts to that. I think firstly, there is a huge gap between common Nepalese and common Chinese. For most of the Nepalese, almost all of the Nepalese, they do not understand Chinese language. They do not understand Chinese culture to a large extent, and
Right.
they do not share the same culture to speak of. So in that sense, there's both a bit of fascination as well, in the sense that when Chinese tourists come here, there is that fascination because it's a new culture to them. But to a large extent, there is ignorance. I think at people-to-people level, I think there are a couple of Confucius institutes now in Kathmandu, which is helping bridge that gap, but that's rather small attempt for us to understand more. So there's that part. In saying that, I think for a lot of Nepalese, China is more of a hope, or what we call mama in our language, that's modest brother, in the sense that if we have any problems here with India, that is somewhere we can look up to. I think that's how a lot of people understand China, that they are not there on a regular basis, but then they are somebody we can face to when we face problems with India. And same thing happened even at political level in 2015.
Right.
That was when we signed an agreement on using Chinese ports. And I think that permeates the Nepali mind, that they do not understand their culture, but then there is a strategic sense of hope. I call it hope rather than much more based on facts, but that's a hope that many Nepalese have when they deal with China. And that, again, largely has to do a lot with how we feel, how Nepalese feel about India. To a large extent, again, for Nepalese, say a kind of inferiority complex with the Indians, that, similar people, similar culture, but they're far more powerful and have a far more influence over us than we have over them. So in that sense, I think China offers that
sort of a counterbalance.
The counterbalance to that. And I think that has permeated among the people who may not understand anything about China, but that's the hope that they have.
From the government, I suppose that they're well aware of, the reputation of China's debt diplomacy and stuff like that. I assume that they're well aware of that. In terms of, the debt diplomacy that got Sri Lanka into trouble and Pakistan into trouble. I assume the Nepali government won't be very clear about that, or do you think that's also a possibility happening now?
I think we are already seeing a bit of that. I think part of the reason, I think there are two Nepalese airports, for example, that were built either with Chinese support or by a Chinese company. I think in Pokhara International Airport, we built that with the Chinese. It was financed by Chinese Exim Export-Import Bank, and then developed by a Chinese company. But I think it is severely suffering from a lack of flights there. And then with, I think, the payment terms coming up rather soon, I find it very difficult to see how they can repay the debt. Is coming up again. Part of that problem again with repayment and debt and the debt trap, there is a lot of debate here as well, and Hamantota or Sri Lanka's case comes up quite a bit in national discussion over here as well. But I think a lot of that also has to do with how we make our decisions on which projects to finance. I think in this context, I think Chinese have simply taken advantage of the chaotic decision making that Nepal has. So not entirely their fault, but because even our political leadership benefits from that kind of relationship, whereby there are certain projects often built at inflated cost, but some of that inflated cost goes to different pockets here in Nepal itself.
Yes, that's how
in
the
that sense, I
Chinese
think
work.
that's how the Chinese work, and that's how we have also taken them. In that sense, I think the risk is real, but the but I think
Still remain.
hopes remain. What I'm trying to get here is, I think the problem has to be shared between both Chinese and Nepalese leaders for that particular case. I think I don't necessarily call it debt trap diplomacy per se with Nepal. It's just like bad decision makers making decisions based on their own personal benefit. So it's more mercantilist way of thinking, in the sense that, a small clique benefits and then let's take the country with it, rather than just Chinese engaging in a influence campaign.
Right. So since we are sort of running out of time, let me try and combine two last questions together.
Sure.
One is that, do you see the Chinese influence growing? I mean, further down the line, few years down the line, do you see Chinese influence growing to be as strong as the Indian influence there, despite the, cultural connect that we already had, number one. And number two, when we talk about issues between the two countries, India and Nepal, is there a, sort of a big brother syndrome at play somewhere? Because that would make, even if India, I mean, the complaint I'm hearing from India is that even if you want to do something altruistic, people suspect our motives. Would that be a correct assessment?
Right. I think Chinese influence is definitely increasing. There's no second doubt about that. And I don't think Nepal is an only example. I think Chinese influence is increasing across the globe. And I'm sure Chinese influence or engagement in India has also increased to a large extent. Right. So in that sense, Nepal is a part of the larger example. I think it's especially started to increase since 2013 and with larger Chinese investment. However, I think Chinese are also beginning to see the limitations of what the influence brings in Nepal. Because I said that because in the last few years, Chinese have seen two major failures in Nepal in what they wanted Nepal to do. The first case was with the Nepal Communist Party, the combined party of the left that was formed. Chinese desperately tried to keep that party together, I think, and they were not successful in doing so. The party finally split, with the Oli faction going back to being the CPN-UML, with the person, the current leader, forming his own party. And there was one more split from the Oli's party again. Right? So in that sense, I think that was one example. The second being, I think Chinese tried really hard for Nepal not to ratify the Millennium Challenge Corporation aid, the $5 million US aid. I think they were really vocal, and that was the first time I have seen Chinese being so vocal about any issues that pertains to Nepal. Right? Because they had a reputation for carrying out diplomacy behind the scene. And this was a time when they were really vocal about their opposition.
Right.
To the extent of attacking American narrative in Nepal publicly. And both of them failed. I think Chinese have just began to engage with Nepal at political level. And with this will come a lot of failures as well. Because with India and Nepal, one good thing is the engagement is so long that we know how to deal with failures much more easily. We know there will be failures, and we know that we can discuss much more openly. I think that's something that I think a lot of Nepalese, not just leaders, but also analysts have limitations with. When they talk about China, there is a certain level of self-censorship that goes on, even when discussing the issues. So in that sense, I think China has a lot to learn. But in saying that, its influence, its engagement has definitely increased. There's no doubt about that. And I think it will continue to increase. Now, will that bring much tangible results the way it wants to? It will, but again, China should be prepared for some failures as well. Regarding the second part about Indian Big Brother attitude, I think that's definitely there. I think, again, it comes together. I think India has a Big Brother attitude, Nepal has an inferiority complex. And I think these two combined, there is always a doubt. Nepalese, in general populace, no matter how much altruistic India becomes, there will be some criticism or questioning of its motives. And I think part of this, again, is our historical learning. I think if we go back to Kautilya, basically, if you set the border, oftentimes for Kautilya, threat often emanates from your closest neighbor. In that sense, I think that has been our learning as well to a large extent. But I think we doubt, not just, I think India is not special in the context because we also tend to doubt the Western aid anytime that happens.
Right.
That
I think we're losing
and the
now.
West, then with the Chinese. So in that sense, I think that perception plays together with the Big Brother attitude. I think there is another perception in Nepal that India tries to, or not just tries, it micromanages. So anything, be it a small event, be it a transfer of a secretary or whatever, for a lot of people, they try to immediately question if India was behind that. Or why would India be doing that? In that sense, I think there is that suspicion. There is that suspicion. And part of that suspicion is because we ourselves are weak and we recognize that internally, but we do not want to accept that we are weak. Therefore, we try to pin the blame on India. And that's a very easy target to put on.
Nobody likes to blame oneself. You always like to blame somebody else.
So in that sense, I think India provides the best order. I think we're also comfortable blaming India because we know, at least with Indians, we can discuss, we can debate, we can disagree, and still be friendly.
That's a very positive note to sort of conclude this interview on. And I really appreciate your taking time out for us. I know you have a very, very hectic schedule. And I hope to have you with us again, not just on Nepal, but maybe even on, the region and Asia Pacific and things like that. It would be a great thing to discuss some of those issues with you. Thank you so very much, Santosh, for joining us today. I really appreciate your coming in at such short notice. And I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you, Sen. It was nice discussing you. Hope to continue this.
Yes.
Online.
Yeah. That was Santosh Sharma Poudel talking to us about Indo-Nepal relations and how we can improve them going forward. I do hope you enjoyed the discussion, and if you did, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And I look forward to seeing you all again next time.